One thing that is worth noting about the way that people perceive the lifestyle in America is largely location dependent. This is something that I've pointed out before, and I've gotten a lot of flack for it. But living in Austin, Texas is not the same thing as living in New York. That is just really true. It is basically true. And if you're looking, for example, at the price of housing and the elevated price of housing, it's very difficult to average the elevated price of housing between areas of the country that are more suburban or rural and big cities.
Tonight on the Unfiltered Take, we're looking at why so many people feel completely priced out of big city life. In this segment, you're going to hear an argument that the affordability crisis isn't just about the economy, it's also about where you choose to live, how often you move, and what happens when everybody crowds into the same few cities. Listen to this, and then I'll jump in with a couple quick breakdowns.
Big cities universally have gone way up because more Americans have moved to those cities and fewer Americans are moving away when the opportunity does not present itself. This is why a few weeks ago, people seemed to get very uptight when I said, listen, there are things we can do in places like New York City to lower housing prices, create more affordability. Those things are not rent freezes. That is subsidizing building of new housing, getting rid of overregulation, making it much easier to cut through all the red tape. All of that can be done. But New York City is never going to be as affordable as Des Moines, Iowa. It's just not going to happen. New York is a restricted area in terms of the amount of land available. It is much more expensive to build there. There are many more people there. And so just again, supply and demand suggest that when demand is really, really, really sky high, like it is in big cities like LA, Chicago, New York, that the housing price is going to be higher than it is where demand is not nearly as high. And none of this is a moral judgment. It is just a fact. And so the point I made is if you're a young person, if you're 20 years old, 21 years old, and you're struggling to afford a place in New York City, and you can find a comparable job in Minnesota, you might want to think about moving. Because just for your own betterment of life, it might be worthwhile to consider not being in New York. And this notion that you are owed the same level of affordability in New York as you are in Des Moines, Iowa, or Minnesota or something, that's silly. That is not how reality works. I also wish for a pony that craps gold.
So this is the part that really hits a nerve with a lot of people. The idea isn't to give up your dream city. It's the math of the supply and demand that doesn't care about our feelings. If millions of people all pile into the same few zip codes, prices are going to reflect that. You can't disagree with his tone, but the question is, does the basic logic match what you're seeing where you live?
But that's not actually how reality... New York will never be as affordable as St. Petersburg, Florida. It's just not going to happen. And pretending that it is, well, I mean, that's a bad way to do life. That doesn't mean we can't make political changes or that we shouldn't. Of course we should. But one of the reasons that you're seeing unaffordability, particularly in major urban areas, is because of high demand and low supply. Well, the high demand is part of that equation. And it is true that the myth that young people have been sold that they never need to move at any point, especially when they are young, before they have kids, when they are first getting out in the world, that's had a real impact in terms of public policy and in terms of pricing. And all these factors have to be taken into account when we determine why things are unaffordable. Because the question is why things are unaffordable, not whether it is moral for things to be unaffordable or not unaffordable. Okay, why are things unaffordable? Well, one reason is because, according to our sponsors at Comet, a project of perplexity, I asked, are 21-year-olds moving less today in the United States than they did in 1980? And is that creating upward pressure on housing prices and downward pressure on wages in major cities? And the answer is yes, residential mobility among young adults has fallen substantially since 1980. And this reduced movement is one factor among several that can raise housing costs in thriving cities, but its effect on wages is more complex and not uniformly downward. Data from the current population survey and related research shows a broad, long-run decline in U.S. residential mobility since the 1980s. In the 1980s, about 20% of Americans moved every year.
That stat right there is wild. We're talking about the economy like it's some mysterious force. If young people are moving as half as much as they did in the 80s, that alone changes everything. Less movement means pressure builds in the same expensive cities, housing gets tighter, and wages don't get to stretch as far because there's a line of people willing to take the same jobs. I'm curious how this hits you. Do you feel stuck where you live? Or would you actually move if it meant better cost of living?
By 2018, 2019, only about 10% did, with especially steep drops among young adults and in short-distance moves. So what is the effect on housing prices? Lower mobility can reduce the flow of people from high-cost, opportunity-rich metros to cheaper areas, keeping demand high in superstar cities, while supply is constrained by zoning and other limits, which tends to push up prices and rents. One of the things that happens in overcrowded cities is NIMBYism. People don't want a gigantic apartment building going up right next door to them in major cities sometimes. They don't want a gigantic block that is filled with cheaper housing going up right next to where they live. May lower their real estate values. And so they vote to stop all of that. And these are political reality. Now, you can try to ban those sorts of regulations and stop those sorts of regulations, and that would be good. But is that going to solve the problem? Obviously, it's not, which is why you've seen mass population movement from north to south. It's why you've seen in-migration to popular regions like the Sun Belt, according to Comet. Now, again, standard economic theory predicts that more workers moving into a city should put downward pressure on wages there, unless local productivity or demand rises enough to offset the larger labor supply. So this is the other problem. If you have a lot of people who are in a city and you have more people moving to that city, that is creating more demand for housing, and it is going to mean less available supply of jobs, right? Because you have more people who are seeking the same job. That creates competition for the jobs, which means that the wages tend to be lowered. So this would explain some of the affordability dislocation. And in fact, when you ask Comet, what percentage of the American population lived in major metros in 1980 compared to today? In 1980, roughly 3/4 of Americans lived in major metros. Today, it is closer to mid-80%. According to the Census Bureau, about 76% of the U.S. population lived in metro areas in 1980, which meant that 1/4 of Americans did not. Okay, so that meant less upward pressure in these major cities. As of 2024, non-metropolitan counties held 14% of the U.S. population, implying that 86% live in metro areas under current federal definitions. So more and more people have been moving to these cities, and fewer people are leaving. And so, again, none of this is inexplicable. It does mean that how do you solve some of this stuff? Well, number one would be you need to get rid of subsidies that lie to people, because subsidies that pretend that affordability can be achieved simply through signing people checks. When government checks go into an area, affordability is usually not the result. Inflation is usually the result in cost. That is true in education. It is true as housing. It is true in healthcare. It is true everywhere. And so government solutions are not going to be the ones that actually fix this. The best the government can do is get out of the way and let the markets.
All right, that's the breakdown. Whenever you're watching from a big coastal city, a small town, or somewhere in between, drop a comment and tell me how things actually feel where you live. Are prices matching the headlines, or does the day-to-day reality look completely different? If you like this kind of calm, long-form analysis, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.